In this news roundup of the week for Friday 23rd of February 2024, Russia makes its first advance in months in Ukraine as the world continues to process the killing of Alexei Navalny. New sanctions against Moscow are announced, but one analysis shows just how leaky that sieve really has become. Western governments, particularly the UK this week, continue to implode over Israel and Hamas, a situation heightened by the release today of Israel's plans for Gaza after the war. This weekend sees the second anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and it's not a moment that comes with a tremendous amount of momentum or hope attached to it. Having almost certainly killed opposition leader Alexei Navalny in prison, the state is insisting that he must be buried in secret, so the event doesn't become a moment to inspire anti-regime sentiment. Navalny died of natural causes, according to Moscow, just like all those Putin opponents who fell out of hotel windows, I expect, and those people who were poisoned with a nerve agent Novichok, as indeed they tried to do to Navalny a few years previously, because yes, it's entirely natural that if your body absorbs Novichok, then you die. Just like it's entirely natural that you die if your plane gets blown up in the sky. Really, you could say that every single person who ever dies in Russia, really, they died of natural causes. Maybe that applies also to the prominent Russian milli-blogger Andrei Morozov, on the grounds that if you commit suicide, then naturally, of course, you're going to die. Why did he do that? Reportedly because he had been ordered to delete his reports of high Russian casualty rates from its retaking of the town Avdiivka a few days ago. Morozov was a sergeant in the military and a trenchant critic of the Russian military command and the Ministry of Defense, a juxtaposition that you might think would put you at significant risk of death by natural causes. In the event, he decided not to wait, and he published a lengthy suicide note detailing how he'd been ordered to remove his report that 16,000 Russian soldiers had died in operations in Avdiivka. According to the Institute for the Understanding of War, Morozov accused Russian generals of wastefully sacrificing thousands of servicemen to advance their military careers, and he implied that most Russian journalists lie about battlefield realities. He said he had been told that if he didn't delete his reports, then his unit would have its supplies of ammunition cut off. He obviously decided that he had reached the end of his good options. It's worth noting that his death was another step in the Russian authorities reclaiming their monopoly over the Russian information space, since Morozov was one of a dwindling now group of independent commentators prepared to criticize the Kremlin and the Ministry of Defense. Since the Wagner mutiny that wasn't, the open critiques from that group have been significantly reduced, either through self-censorship or from others who have been arrested or removed or died of natural causes. Meanwhile, the open question is whether the recent Russian advance on the battlefield was the direct result of US funding being held up in Congress, so that it's simply running out of the ammunition that it needs. As European countries have been visibly seeking to come to terms with the potential fallout should President Trump win a second term this year, they have been seeking to raise $1.5 billion in emergency funding to provide Ukraine with artillery shells. This was organised by the Czech Republic, having located a source from outside the EU that has capacity to provide those shells. Ukraine has said that it needs 2.5 million artillery shells this year. So far, the EU has sent just around 400,000. However, the EU being what it is, of course, it's not simple. For example, France and Greece have said that the EU military aid should be sourced only from EU manufacturers, which would mean that they would not support the Czech plan. In the meantime, Navalny's death has prompted a raft of new sanctions against Russia, hundreds of them announced, for example, by President Biden. Nobody expects them to make that much difference. One story that got little attention this week was an analysis by Ed Conway of Sky and author of The Material World about how British companies, and it's not just restricted to the British ones, are unofficially supporting Russia's war machine. Now, of course, that's not supposed to happen. As this graph shows, when the Russian invasion of Ukraine happened, UK exports to Russia plummeted. Partly as a result of corporations pulling from there voluntarily, but then quickly, of course, because sanctions were imposed to stop companies from exporting particularly the type of goods, machinery and vehicles that could most easily be used and repurposed for the war. And this graph confirms machinery and motor vehicles stopped being shipped from the UK to Russia. So that's all good then, right? And the fact that the Russian economy is looking strong and their equipment keeps appearing on the battlefield, at least that has nothing to do with us. But what if you look to see what's been happening recently in terms of the UK exports to Russia-friendly countries? For example, the Central Asia state of Kyrgyzstan. According to the UK Tax Department, HMRC, this is how exports of machinery, motor vehicles and everything else has been going in relation to Kyrgyzstan. Now, I'm not an expert when it comes to analysing graphs, but I'm definitely seeing something going on there. The same has been true for Armenia, another Russia ally, although that may be changing as we speak, since Armenia is not best pleased about how Russia's defence guarantees have proven to be worthless when they needed them the most. Interestingly, Kazakhstan was another one, except that in September last year, President Tokayev visited Germany and promised Western governments that Kazakhstan would follow the sanctions regime, after which moment the trade plummeted, showing both the unsurprising truth that the increase is associated with sanctions busting and the important truth that this is a government decision either way. Of course, it isn't just the UK. German exports of cars and parts to Kyrgyzstan have risen 5,000% since Russia's invasion. Poland has seen similar shifts. But are the cars and machinery that are being exported actually the specific items that we know are being used to kill Ukrainians on the battlefield? Here's a chart that specifically covers those items, more being exported than ever before. These cover drone, plane and helicopter parts, data processing machines, telephone switching equipment, aeronautical navigation equipment, and radio navigational aids. None of this is unique, of course. Capitalism is what it is, and demand for goods sooner or later gets met by suppliers of those goods. For example, the steep trade tariffs levied against China by President Trump and then retained by President Biden, has seen China shipping a lot more to Mexico, and Mexico shipping a lot more to America. What could possibly be happening there, I wonder? Cars imported to the US from Mexico get a 2.5% tariff, parts put together in Mexico can be as low as 0%, cars and parts from China get hit by a 25% levy. So no big surprise that 33 Chinese-owned companies with operations in Mexico sent $1.1 billion worth of parts to the US in 2023, up from $700 million in 2021. Also, China is building higher trade surpluses with Vietnam, Singapore and the Philippines, which are in turn widening their trade surpluses with the United States. Meanwhile, the geopolitical issue that is really shaking the Western countries apart is Israel and Gaza. Western countries are seeing the tensions over the conflict continue to ripple through their politics as they try to reconcile the horror of the original Hamas attack against Israeli civilians with the devastation now being experienced by Palestinian civilians in Gaza. In the UK, this resulted in a massive blow-up in Parliament as the Speaker of the House broke with tradition in allowing a Labour Party amendment to an Opposition Day motion by the SNP. That basically enabled Labour, by getting its amendment passed, to hijack the day reserved for a different party. It helped the Labour leader avoid a potential rebellion from his MPs and caused outrage and a walkout by the government and the SNP, and resulted in calls for the Speaker to be forced to resign. All of that came basically down to the question, do you call for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, or do you call for a temporary humanitarian pause? The parliamentary chaos wasn't the only breach of protocol. We saw the heir to the throne, Prince William, Prince of Wales, calling for an end to the fighting as soon as possible. Bear in mind, William toured the occupied West Bank back in 2018, the first member of the royal family to do so. The only problem is that the royal family is not meant to make political statements, especially on issues of huge current contention. People just about tolerated his father, Charles, during his time as Prince of Wales, campaigning on issues that generally weren't points of major disagreement between the parties. This was starting to get out of that zone. Now, fortunately, it was expressed in reasonably general terms. The UK government quickly said that the statement was consistent with its position. What was said privately, we don't know. Someday, I expect, we might well find out. Israel was unsurprisingly not happy about the intervention, although according to reports decided not to push back hard in the way that they have against other similar commenters, since they did not want to get into a row with the future king. Some figures on the UK political right, of course, felt no such compunction. Nigel Farage, for instance, saying that it had been a step too far for the country's future king. And Israel certainly had a more robust reaction to Brazil's President Lula, who compared what was happening in Gaza to, yes, the Holocaust. Lula had previously had warm connections with Israel. This, however, counts as something of a low point. But even the Israel-supporting world is finding it harder to ignore the reports of, for example, children dying from malnutrition in Gaza and the impact of Israel's actions there continuing to play out. Indeed, the desperate conditions have seen something of a collapse in basic law and order, resulting in aid convoys being looted by desperate citizens and probably also by Hamas fighters, or at least by organised and armed gangs, which probably means Hamas fighters. A resolution to demand an immediate ceasefire was again put to the United Nations Security Council this week, only to be vetoed once again by the United States. 13 out of the 15 members voted for the motion. The UK abstained. The US said that negotiations between Hamas and Israel are currently taking place over a pause, so this wasn't the time for such a resolution to be passed. The US has suggested an alternative resolution which calls for a temporary ceasefire on the condition that all hostages are released. It's not entirely clear if that motion will even be put. Observers said that it was the first time the US had even signed up to that form of wording and ascribed it to growing frustration from the Biden administration towards Netanyahu and the current Israeli government. Such frustration probably won't be alleviated by Israel's plans for Gaza, which were unveiled today. The one-page document rejects steps towards recognition of a Palestinian state, something that Netanyahu has always been resolutely against. It says that Israel will continue its blockade of the territory and will remain involved in matters such as how local police operate and what schools and mosques teach. It is determined that the territory will be demilitarized, but the vision for doing so, although only vaguely described, can easily be taken as the description of full Israeli occupation. Nobody will be allowed to be involved with enforcing public order or any other local management if they have any historical links with states or bodies that support terror. In other words, Israel gets to choose who's in charge, regardless of what the population does or doesn't think about it. Since large parts of the population are quite likely to have been heavily radicalized by the incessant bombing and military actions of the last few months, that is probably what the Israelis see to be necessary, at least in the short term. Whether that vision will hold or not is another question, and must surely depend on whether there's an Israeli renewed offensive on Rafah, with the likely humanitarian consequences that would follow. What does seem certain is that Western governments will continue to struggle with their own positions in relation to this, given the sharp polarizations within their own ranks. In other words, geopolitical tensions are high across the world right now. The measure of all of us, and particularly the political leaders, will be the ability to hold our nerve and to keep focused on what needs to be done. My thanks as always to people who support this channel on Patreon. As you know, this channel would not be possible without that support. If you would like to add yours, please head on over to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. It is always appreciated. Either way, have a great week. See you next time.